Hello, this is Skylit Lake reading Long Night in the Valley by Maraleus. Chapter 6. Plans were made and discarded. Different plans were made and they were also discarded. The problem, beside the fact that Blast Planner, except Yarozu, were out of commission, was that no one knew what needed to be done. If anything, yes, Midoriya had ran out of the testing center. Yes, the whole situation where Midoriya was initially placed in a group apart from all the rest of them was shady. Yes, the fact that Aizawa and the other half of the class was still missing was distressing. But they couldn't know what was actually happening. They didn't know if the others needed help or what help they would need. They didn't know why Midoriya was running, chased by heroes of all things. Jiro had wondered out loud if Midoriya had been mind-controlled by a villain with a quirk, like Shinso's. In response, Kanari had a brief breakdown agonizing about whether he had inadvertently helped a villain kidnap his friends. What a mad banquet of darkness. Luckily, they were training for, well, not this situation, but situations. Just in general. Dark, mysterious situations where one wrong step could set a person plummeting into the abyss of mystery. Anyway, when in such a vexing, perilous situation, the thing to do, as Momo pointed out, was gather information. Was Jiro plugged into the wall? Yes. Did Shoji manifest enough ears and eyes to make even Fumikage slightly disturbed? Yes. Did Yarozu make tiny listening devices that fit on mice and insects that Izuku had called? Yes. Did Kaminari spontaneously manifest hacking skills that no one knew he had and then denied that they were hacking skills? Yes. Had Dark Shadow pressed herself flat to sneak under doors and temporary room partitions? Also yes. He tugged on Dark Shadow with his mind, directing her to return. Find anything new? He asked. Sue, his current partner in not crime quite yet, and Lookout, leaned closer as well, interested. The lady whose quirk they were using passed out. Everyone she used it on is still asleep. Nothing on Midori? Asked Sue. Dark Shadow's facial expressions were often limited, but this case her scowl was clear. Stupid stuff. Like what? Dark Shadow huffed, and Fumikage felt her annoyance. Like he's a villain or a spy, stupid. Sue closed her eyes and swallowed with obvious distaste. Do you think that's why he ran? It seems unlike him. Huh? Said Dark Shadow. Midori didn't run. What are you talking about, Dark Shadow? Asked Fumikabe. Speak clearly. Dark Shadow elbowed him. Midoriya's friends ran. You mean the Chako, Todoroki, and Ida? No, they're still asleep. His friends. Like you and me friends, Sumi. You mean his quirk? Uh-huh, said Dark Shadow, bobbing. They're like us, isn't obvious? Not really, said Sue. Fumikage leaned against the wall and slid down to put his head in his hands. What a mad banquet of darkness indeed. It is as if we journeyed at night through a verdant and shadowy valley. Come on, we have to tell the others, said Sue, nudging him. What happened? Asked Hitoshi softly, but not believing what he'd heard. He'd rubbed his fingers over the folds of his artificial vocal cords, stored in the top pocket of his backpack. Legally speaking, he wasn't supposed to have it, or any hero support gear. Outside of the school, he wasn't licensed, even provisionally. But Hisashi had insisted, and Kayama didn't object, so... According to the Hero Commission, said Hisashi, a voice tighter than his hands around the wheel, Shoto and some of Class 1A were targeted by villains at the testing venter. What? What villains? Shigaraki? That was... That was the one that had been targeting 1A again and again and again. The one that had hurt him so badly at the USJ. No, said Hisashi. They said it was Midoriya. Hitoshi blinked, his brain trying to find a Midoriya that matched the name before shoving his fellow student's face into his mind's eye. You mean he's the one that wound up fighting the villain? How many bones did he break this time? Or did he get a new quirk? No, said Kayama. They're saying that Midoriya is the villain. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. They think the second coming of All Might Sunshine Child is a villain? If he got locked in Tartarus, half the population would, I don't know, start confessing their sins and become model citizens before the day was out. If his quirk wasn't bone-breaking nonsense, I would say it was the power of friendship. He stopped, considered the last question. Wait, this was about his quirk, isn't it? We don't know, said Hisashi. They're saying he kidnapped All Might. Hitoshi wondered if this was what people felt like when he used his quirk on them, because his brain just blue-screened and was struggling to retreat. There what? Screeched Hisashi. It was a good thing he was the one driving the car. Hitoshi winced and covered his ear. Didn't All Might steal Vlad Sensei's car? Asked Hitoshi, feeling dazed. How do you get from that to Midoriya kidnapping him from across town? I don't know, said Kayama, but it's all over the Hironet, and the commission is starting to release it to news networks. That has to be the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I'd put more money that Yagi is kidnapping Midoriya, said Hisashi loudly and angrily. What the rat god said before we left makes much more sense now, said Kayama mournfully. Hitoshi blanched at reference to the principal, but then curiosity got the better of him. What did he say? That to keep custody of all our staff and students, we're going to have to be creative. Hitoshi was expecting many things upon arriving at the testing center. Being refused access to unconscious teacher and students was one of them. Obstructive bureaucracy was one of them. People telling him something was illegal or forbidden by protocol when he knew it wasn't was one of them. Chaos was one of them. Confusion was one of them. Lack of organization was one of them. In these cases, he was not disappointed. What he didn't expect, however, was the remaining half of Chodo's class to not only be 100% down with the kind of sort of kidnapping, but to have already laid a lot of groundwork for it already. Maybe he should have, but he didn't. How was it that Aizawa, aka Mr. Explosion, aka You Have No Potential, had kept all students from a class, had no issues against committing things that most people consider crimes? A class that, having been given time to bond, would probably collectively turn to villainy, then betray one of their members. He paused, considering his long relationship with Shota. Mentally squinting, he could see it now. It wasn't as if Hisashi wasn't like that too. He had never really considered expelling any of them, except Mineta. Grape juice was on thin ice. We most likely would have acted already, Yaoyorozu said as the rest of the class distracted commission officials who were supposedly supervising the pickup of children. But we didn't know what we'd do after. No escape plans. Reasonable. The bus driver, Greenlight the transit hero, had gone back to school after dropping them off, and had to turn around once he heard the news. But now, Recovery Girl was coming around with a fleet of ambulances from the Hero Hospital Yui contracted with, a hospital that was incidentally not the same as the one the Hero Commission wanted to bring all the people affected by Saito's quirk. Ambulances had room for riders. It was unorthodox, but it would work. Well, said Hisashi quietly. No one expected him to be quiet, It made him almost invisible when he was. "I know you already have a plan," interjected Hitoshi, "but is there anything I can do?" Momo blinked. "Actually, yes. We could get them out of the way, but it would help a lot if we had the keys." The search for Uraka had been going well before the city started to fall apart around them. In fact, it had been going incredibly poorly, because various versions of All Might kept popping up to try and punch Suzuki's face off. Literally, at least 2 of the All Mights had declared that as their intention prior to attacking. Tenya wasn't sure if he should be concerned about Midoriya's mental state or baffled about his incredibly violent view of All Might. Perhaps the eyeless villain in Camino had left a strong impression on him, but All Might couldn't have been responsible for the villain's injuries. It was All Might. He'd hardly ever injured villains he took down. On the other hand, the villain at Camino had been terrifyingly strong. If there were to be an exception to the rule, he was certainly it. But the real reason, in Tenya's opinion, the search had been going poorly for Suzuki was that the man would not stop talking. His theories were even worse than Todoroki's. "That All Might is fake," he says. "He isn't even using his quirk, just like Midoriya. I think we all know that the All Might that exists in Midoriya's head is not in fact the real All Might," said Aizawa. "This destruction is just another ploy, another distraction." "We get it. But it isn't centered around us, so logically it must be centered around Uraka." Suzuki scoffed. "We should be looking for what Midoriya is trying to hide. The only reason we aren't beating you up right now is that we are looking for Uraka, so shut up," said Aizawa. "What about me?" Tenya whipped around to see Uraka stooped over behind them, breathing heavily, hands on her knees. "Sorry," she said. "I ran all the way here." Izuku hurried over to her. Tenya noted that he had never quite turned his back to Suzuki. "What happened?" he asked. "Where were you?" Izuku wanted to talk to me," she said. "He said something dangerous was about to happen. But if we went further in, we could maybe get out." Under normal circumstances, the overly vague report would have been cause for a scolding, but Tenya could see how her eyes flicked to Suzuki. There were details she didn't want him to hear. "Did he say how to go further in?" asked Aizawa. "No. That happened, and he ran off." She gestured towards another building that was slowly collapsing. "Wait a moment. If you're here, what's there?" Said Uraka. "He told you, didn't he? What did he say?" "Excuse me," said Tenya. "You're being very rude right now. Uraka has just come back from a harrowing experience." Tenya was not very good at lying, but this wasn't a lie per se. The distinction didn't matter to Suzuki, who gave a brief, incredulous look before turning back to the gathering storm. "He doesn't want to see us." "Don't you dare," said Aizawa, eyes narrowing. Suzuki didn't listen. Tenya caught up to him without any trouble, punched him in the back of the head. "Ow," said Tenya, who had forgotten he wasn't wearing his hero costume. "Did you break your fingers?" asked Aizawa as he dragged Suzuki back by the foot. "I'm going to have you all arrested and stripped of your hero licenses unless because we didn't help you with an illegal interrogation." "No, you're not," said Aizawa. "Nana!" The voice bounced off the buildings and was swept away by the wind. "Nana! Master, where are you?" It was the voice of younger, Vigilante All Might. Is he calling the name or the number? asked Uraraka. "Master, please, answer me." With a shuddering heave, the building right next to them tipped over, falling into rubble before it could even hit the ground. The storm wind, heavy with rain and lightning, whipped down the street with all the force of a hurricane. Tenya had to brace himself and cover his eyes. Then he could see again. It was to discover Suzuki had ran off again, towards the falling buildings. Tenya was honestly torn between letting him get beat up by whatever had flattened the building, whether it be Midoriya's subconscious, the illusionary All Might, or worse, although arguably all those were the same thing. But Tenya was training to be a hero. Heroes couldn't pick and choose who to save. He and everyone else took off after Suzuki. They all stopped though when a boy in a torn UA uniform clambered over the rubble. The boy cupped his hands around his mouth. "Nana!" The hair was recognizable from a mile away, not to mention the height. All Might. Yet a different version. Tenya had known UA was All Might's alma mater, but seeing him in a uniform like this, seeing him vulnerable, not in the way of a man at the end of his career, but as someone just starting out, someone like them, was utterly humbling and both completely terrifying. What pushed him to this? What put that distraught tone in his voice? What put that bloody slash in his uniform and bruised his face? Tenya had a slinking suspicion he knew what. He didn't even want to come in contact with the memory of that monster from Camino. All Might was scanning the ground, looking for something? Someone? His eyes fell on them, and even from a distance Tenya could see them widen. All Might began to scramble down the hill. "You," he shouted. "You underclassmen, have you seen?" He gasped for air. Even Suzuki, for what he could see, looked taken aback. "Have you seen a woman about?" He hesitated, adjusted his hand downward to about the height of his chin, which is still taller than Tenya. All Might was tall in high school, or at least Midoriya thought All Might was tall in high school. This was confusing. A woman about this tall. She has black hair, wears it half up. All Might fanned his hands behind his head to illustrate. She's a hero. Wears yellow gloves. He paused for a moment, eyes flicking from one to the other. "You haven't seen her?" He whipped back around. "Nana!" "What even is this supposed to be?" demanded Suzuki. Truly, their bond is inspiring. For an All Might to tell Midoriya even of this tragedy. "Todoroki, that was entirely inappropriate," exclaimed Tenya, turning to face his classmate. The wind picked up again. The building began to twinkle. "Earlier, you said something about being a vigilante. What was up with that anyway?" Midoriya's voice sounded like it was right next to him, and yet the voice was entirely sourceless. The colors shifted. "Izuku wasn't sure if you wanted to curse the bystander culture, encouraged by the hero system, or bless it for its unintentional effects." Even though Toshinori was clearly suffering, slumped against the wall and shoulders heaving, no one stopped to help him. In fact, most people averted their eyes, barely looking at him. Generally speaking, Izuku decided he'd curse it. In this particular instance, however, it benefited him. Looking back and forth before dashing across the street, not caring about jaywalking at the moment, he jogged up to Toshinori, swallowing the name before it left his lips. Right, they were undercover. The commission definitely knew Toshinori's real name. "Dad," he said instead. and mentally felt himself collide with a wall. Couldn't he pick up something better? Can't come up with a fake name, or just not use a name to begin with? With effort, he picked himself up, and his dream self kept running. "I got your text," he said. Instead, for the benefit of anyone listening, he inserted himself under one of Toshinori's arms. "Let's go." He smiled. He smiled at a couple of people who were stirring and hoped they wouldn't report this. I can walk," said Toshinori, heaving himself off the wall with a shudder. "I'm fine." This was a lie. Izuku could still see the flashbacks playing out in his mind's eye. Even so, he nodded and tried to give Toshinori space, even as Toshinori put one hand on his shoulder and leaned heavily. This mental invasion was wearing both of them out. No, all of them out. This was not, they reminded, at all normal. 5 gently pressed ways of dealing with flashback into his awareness. Thank God for 5 and his comparative normalcy. "We're okay," he said. "We're just on a street in Mustafu. You can feel me, right? And the sidewalk under his feet, and you can hear the traffic and the smell of the cars." He kept going. Toshinori gave a hum of assent. After each item listed, he could tell it wasn't enough. He might be able to see and hear, to touch and taste, but he could do the same things to that mental battleground. "What if," said Izuku, "you tell me a story?" "A story?" rasped Toshinori. "Yeah. Earlier you said something about being a vigilante. What was up with that anyway?" "It isn't well known," said Yagi's voice, as the world came back into focus in an entirely different city, with entirely different weather and signage. "But I didn't grow up in a terribly pleasant area. In fact, there was quite a lot of crime." Aizawa caught sight of a familiar head of yellow hair positioned above a plain Gakuren. The younger version of Yagi was staring down an alley. Suddenly, Aizawa felt himself pulled to a stand right behind Yagi. A man with a mutation quirk was being mugged by 2 men with fire quirks. He blinked. The sign didn't change. Even behind his eyelids, he couldn't see his students or Suzuki. What was this cutscene? I rather disliked that. Obviously, my thoughts about becoming the symbol of peace for the world were, well, just thoughts. But even then, for my own little corner of the world, I wanted to make a difference. Yagi, showcasing the fact that he'd always been a bit of an idiot, pulled on a medical mask and threw his book bag at the muggers, and punched the other one in the face. At least he wasn't using his quirk to do it. The villain would have been pasted on the side of the building. On the other hand, this was presumably some imagining of Midoriya's, possibly based on a story he heard from All Might, if the voiceover was anything to go by. "Oh," said Midoriya, "I did that a couple of times. Stop a mugging, I mean." "I thought you said you weren't involved in any vigilantism." "It wasn't vigilantism. They were just things I happened to run into, and I couldn't just not help. Sometimes I wonder if your quirk really isn't something like a villain magnet." The scene shifted again, making Aizawa feel dizzy. Even though he wasn't moving, except maybe that was why he felt dizzy. Motion sickness. "I never knew my parents. I grew up in a foster home." Aizawa blinked. The scene became clear. A small apartment building with a tiny tattered lawn. Someone's shoe had been left on the sidewalk in front, and Yagi was climbing the stairs to the door. Then Aizawa was inside, and internally wincing at the noise level. Screaming preteens were so far out of his normal comfort level that you couldn't see it with a telescope. The exception was, of course, Eri. As he watched, Yagi was shoved several times, tripped, and had water manipulation quirks used to drop something that Aizawa suspected was toilet water on his head. Overall, the attitude towards the people like us wasn't quite what it was now, but to be parentless on top of that, many of the other children at the home thought there had to be something wrong with me. There was a sigh. Judging from what I've seen of your memories, I suspect you had the worst of it. I had a mum though. Aizawa found himself in a small bedroom. Pinned to one of the walls was a quirk board, which looked distressingly like Todoroki's. Yagi crossed his arms as he contemplated on it. Once I had built up my confidence, one thing I was trying to do was find out about a human trafficking ring. Oh yeah, those suck. Why do I feel like you have personal experience in the subject matter? It wasn't my fault. Soft, fond laughter filled the room before it was whisked away and replaced with a warehouse that just screamed villain hideout. There was a fight. I tried my best, tried to be sneaky. I knew I wouldn't win in a straight-out fight, but Yagi was surrounded and clearly losing. Then the doors burst open. A figure floated, framed by the threshold, backlit by the streetlights. First contact, whispered a voice like the wind. Nana, said Midoriya. Nana, agreed All Might's voice. She saved me. I didn't want to get caught. I ran, went back to the muggings, and then another change in scenery. A sidewalk by a stream. Yagi stood in his gakuen a few meters away from a woman in a hero costume. The yellow gloves stood out, and then, a week later, she found me. The woman's head snapped in Aizawa's direction, and he had just enough time to realize she could see him before the scene glitched out and he was falling through an empty sky. Hey guys! I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been quite a wild ride with all the information and history that All Might has shared in this chapter. Love the connection between him and Izuku. Also, I loved Hitoshi's commentary at the start. His sass always gets me and makes me laugh. Anyway, I have been recording quite a bit and uploaded quite a bit. By now, my first Naruto podfic should be out. Obviously, it hasn't been released yet to the public, but it's just sitting there. So hopefully that goes well, and I hope you guys enjoy that as well. And I'll see you guys later. Bye!